Elaine Scarry. She was elected to the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her awards include honorary degrees from Northwestern. She won the Truman Capote Award for Literary Criticism. Her work has two central subjects: the nature of the physical injury and the nature of human creation. The Body and Pain brings the subjects of injuring and creating together. It argues that the willful infliction of pain and injury is the opposite of creation, since it apes and inverts the ordinary work of the imagination. Her writing includes Thermonuclear Monarchy, Choosing Between Democracy and Doom, and shows that nuclear weapons and governance are mutually exclusive. So Elaine will present first.
Well, all of you are valiant to be here as long as you've been here, and I'm grateful to Jay and Chuck for being part of this conference, and I'm delighted to be on a panel with Vincent and Ray. My topic is just a summary of the physical architecture of the nuclear arsenal and the mental architecture of the nuclear arsenal. And it's the mental architecture in which we have a big part to play, and it's the mental architecture that keeps the physical architecture in place. This graph gives a brief glimpse of the physical architecture, and there's much to say about it. I'll just make 3 quick points. First of all, each of the icons needs to be multiplied by 5. That is, the key to the chart tells us that each icon represents 5 warheads. The second thing to see is that 94% of the world arsenal is owned by the United States and Russia. All the weapons from 2 o'clock down to 8 o'clock are owned by the United States, all the way through the circle, and all the weapons from 7 o'clock over to 2 o'clock are owned by the Russians. And then the small wedge at about 1 o'clock are the 7 other countries. The smallest arsenal is that of North Korea. North Korea owns probably fewer than 20 missiles. Once in a while you hear an estimate as high as 60. But most reliable estimates say fewer than 20, whereas we have, as you can see, 6,450. The third thing to say about this chart is just that it's a reminder of the thousands of steps that are needed to put this kind of vast architecture in place. And 99.9% of those steps are already in place. There's only 1 step left, at least in the case of the United States arrangements, namely the launch itself. So the time is very short, and that's why the clock at the center from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists says that it's so close to midnight. The second thing to say about the architecture is the simple fact that every weapon has 2 ends, the end from which it is fired and the end that injures. What makes the injuring end of a nuclear weapon unusual is the catastrophically high number of people that will be killed on a single afternoon. What makes the firing end unusual is that the launch is executed by a single individual. Now, usually when we, or at least the American public at large, talks about weapons, they use the language of weapons of mass destruction, which is indeed accurate. But notice that that only calls attention to the anomaly of one end, the spectacularly large number of people injured. Whereas the other end, which is equally unusual and obscene, is that these injuries are being brought about by a single person. In the case of a revolver, you have 1 person firing and normally 1 person injured. In the case of a submarine, what's the word I'm looking for? A machine gun. All I could think of was submarine. A machine gun, 1 person fires and it's maybe 50 people that are injured. And we see that as an obscenity. Now imagine, which is the accurate case of the matter, 1 person firing and many, many millions being injured in a day. That's the case that we have with nuclear weapons. And it's also the case that keeping these 2 ends in mind is crucial because different laws can be used to address and remedy the 2 ends of the weapon. That gives us 2 spheres to work with. The injuring end of the weapon is utterly incompatible with international law, and therefore international law can be brought to bear on it. International law says you can't commit genocide. International law says you can't bring about disproportionate suffering. International law says you can't target civilian. International law says you can't ruin the ozone layer. International law says you can't destroy the environment. So because international law and nuclear weapons are mutually exclusive, right now we have nuclear weapons and we don't have international law. But if you bring international law back, you're going to have to get rid of nuclear weapons because they're absolutely mutually exclusive. The same is true with the second provision there, the firing end of the weapon. That is utterly incompatible with national law, with constitutional law in our own country and other countries, and it can be used to, national law, constitutional law, can be used to address it. And this is crucial because, of course, the international law has language that we immediately recognize as moral and addressing the value questions of the value of human life. Whereas this law that I'm going to be talking about now sometimes sounds procedural and doesn't immediately seem to have the same incendiary ethical content, but I assure you that it does, and in fact we've been hearing references to it all day. So why is the solitary launch of a nuclear weapon at odds with the United States Constitution? And I'll then talk for a moment about other constitutions. Well, when the US Constitution was formed at the Constitutional Convention, they debated what body should be in charge of overseeing our entry into war. And they decided that it had to be the largest body possible. They argued that it could not be the president. They argued that it could not be the House working alone, that it could not be the Senate working alone, that it had to be the largest governing body, namely the full Congress, which would be 535 people today. Okay, that provided a very big break, and as we know from Thomas Hobbes and the Leviathan, the whole point of the social contract was getting us out of the miserable condition of war. That's something that Hobbes says over and over again. So this isn't just an incidental phrase in the Constitution. It's the cornerstone of the Constitution, as Joseph Story said in the 19th century. And yet, that's just the first break. When the Constitution went out to the ratification assemblies, the people said, no, we need a second break. We need a second break that says that in order to go to war, you have to convince the population of this country that there's a reason to injure those foreign people over there. Now, the name of this law is going to sound surprising to you because it's been so poisoned in recent years, but the name of this law is the right to bear arms. What the right to bear arms says is, however much injuring power this country has, every single person has an equal share of it. Every single person has a small piece of it over which they're responsible for giving or withholding authority for its use. So that means that we have two breaks on going to war. The first, the requirement for a congressional declaration of war, which is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, and the second is the Second Amendment. And since the invention of nuclear weapons, we've essentially had neither of these. There has not been a single legitimate congressional declaration of war, even in the case of conventional wars like Korea, Vietnam, etc., since the invention of nuclear weapons, and that's not a coincidence. So too, for a while, we still had the right to bear arms with soldiers fighting, and then we got rid of the draft, and now none of us pays any attention to where our country is declaring war and carrying out wars. In my book, there's not time now, but in the investigation of the first break on war, I contrast the 5 cases where we've had a congressional declaration of war, which is the War of 1812 and going up through World War II. I contrast the quality of the deliberation in those congressional talks, which is extremely high quality of deliberation, with the utter absence of deliberation in cases where presidents have considered first use. And I chose the examples of Eisenhower in the Taiwan Straits crisis in '54 when he considered dropping an atomic bomb in the Taiwan Straits, and Eisenhower in '59 when he considered a first use against Russia in the Berlin crisis. And the difference between these two forms of deliberation, or more properly speaking, the presidential one, should not even be construed as a form of deliberation, is vast. In the one case, people, like people in this room, consider themselves equal. Everybody can disagree with and provide objections to what anyone else says. In a presidential council, everyone is deferring to the one man at the top. And the differences are numerous between the two, starting with the fact that congressional declarations of war are open to public view, whereas the presidential acts remain hidden for 30 years, and ending most importantly with the fact that in the congressional declarations of war, there's tremendous consent and testing of the proposition that this other country did something that warrants going to war. Whereas in the case of presidential deliberation, there's only the smallest shred of dissent, which I would love to tell you about in more detail if there were more time. In the case of the second break on war, the right to bear arms, again, this is something that is a distributive amendment. It's a way of holding vast military power within a civil frame by breaking it up and dividing it among all the people. And it's prior to the question of how much weaponry we have. Whether we have a vast arsenal or no arsenal at all, however much we have, it's going to be equally divided across all of us. So true is this that militarists and pacifists have alike credited the importance of the right to bear arms. For example, Gandhi said, "Of all the evil committed by England against India, the worst is the disarming of the population. Give us back our arms, and then we'll tell you whether we're going to use them or not." Gandhi didn't want to use arms, but he was simply saying that you can't have a few people in the room who have weapons and have the rest of the people just hoping that they won't turn those weapons on the population itself. And it is something that has been responsible for the kind of civic stature that we've all gained. For example, the 15th Amendment that distributed the right to vote to African Americans was voted on the basis that 180,000 blacks had fought in the Civil War and had to have the right to vote. So too with women in the 19th Amendment. So too with the 26th Amendment that lowered the voting age from 21 to 18 on the basis of both those who went to Vietnam and those who protested Vietnam at home. So this double location gives it a tremendous gravity and weight because it's hard to get through two gates. That's the difference between congressional law and statutory law. Statutory law only requires a legislative act, whereas constitutional law requires both a congressional act and ratification by the people. And in effect, the Second Amendment was intended to be a ratification by the population of the congressional sense that we had to go to war. Not accidentally, we find this in other constitutions, which I've read through of the other nuclear states, and I'll just take one example. The Russian Federation Constitution says that if Russia is attacked, the head of the country can begin to act up to the border, but not one step beyond. If he wants to carry out an offensive war, that is, go one step beyond the boundary, he has to get the authorization of what is the equivalent of the Parliament or our Congress. Also, Article 59 has something that is the equivalent of our right to bear arms. It says, in case Russia is attacked, it is the obligation of every adult Russian, man or woman, to defend the country. So that is the same kind of provision. There are, as you've heard several times today, 2 bills currently in front of Congress that prohibit presidential first use of nuclear weapons, the Markey-Liu bill and the Warner-Smith bill, and all of us need to be pressing Congress to get this passed. It still has a long, long way to go. As you heard from Zia Mian this morning, in the case of New Jersey, only 3 of the state's 12 representatives in the House have so far co-sponsored it, and neither of their senators have. My own state is just a little bit better than that, but we have a long way to go. Now, what is the mental architecture that is keeping this physical architecture in place? I think that there are actually 6 answers. One of them is the lack of information. For example, as you've heard today, we have a first-use policy and have had a first-use policy in the whole nuclear age, and yet most Americans think, well, surely these things would only be used defensively. Second, we have a false justification, the justification of deterrence, by which we're told that it's safer, what keeps us safe from nuclear war is having nuclear weapons, when clearly it would be not having nuclear weapons that would keep us safe from nuclear war. And if you read the last sentence of this statement by the former head of our Strategic Air Command, General Lee Butler, you see that even within the military, this is seen as a fraud. He says deterrence was premised on a litany of unwarranted assumptions, unprovable assertions, and logical contradictions. The third answer is that the population has come to believe that once nuclear weapons are made, they can't be unmade, which is a crazy idea. It's simply untrue. It may be hard to roll back global warming, but we have to try and do it, but it's not clear how to do it. It's very clear how to dismantle nuclear weapons, and one study in Scotland by John Ainsley showed that some parts of it can be done in hours, like the dismantling of the nuclear triggers. Other parts will take longer. The whole thing can be done, in the case of Britain, in between 2 and 4 years. It would take much longer for us since we have a much bigger arsenal, but it's a finite project that is in mind. And another form of assurance that these can be unmade is the fact that the whole southern hemisphere is blanketed with nuclear weapons-free zones. In fact, if you look at this on Wiki, you'll see that the nuclear architecture is a north-south architecture. The countries in red are in the northern hemisphere, they're the nuclear states. The countries in blue are the nuclear weapons treaty-free zone states, and they're southern hemisphere states. The fourth reason is that this becomes circular. In the nuclear age, if constitutions and nuclear weapons are mutually exclusive, then by having nuclear weapons, it's not just that the constitutional provisions disappeared, they were disparaged and belittled, so that people just kind of scoff at the idea of a constitutional requirement for a declaration of war. And of course, as we all know, the right to bear arms has been misconstrued as a kind of poisonous provision that lets men go into schools and shoot children, which is about as far from the original meaning of the right to bear arms as you could possibly have. There are two other provisions, but I think for the shortage of time, I'll just say that this disempowering of the constitutional provisions goes all the way back to the centuries of social contract thinking out of which constitutions emerged, so that Thomas Hobbes, who, as I said earlier, on every page has a statement about how the social contract exists to ensure peace, and who says that the most catastrophic thing that could happen in a state is the massacre of the citizenry. He says if that happens, he says it couldn't happen in a monarchy, a democracy, or an oligarchy. It could only happen where there's no governance at all. And yet he has been made in the nuclear age an apologist for nuclear arms, just as one more way in which nuclear weapons deform all our thinking. So I end my own book by talking about John Locke's observation that Caligula said that he wished the people had but one neck so that he might dispatch them all at a single blow. That has been literalized today. Our monarchs do have the power to dispatch us all at one blow because we all have one neck. Thank you.
Vincent Intondi is a professor of history and director of the Institute for Race, Justice, and Civic Engagement at Montgomery College in Tacoma Park, Maryland. He's the author of the book, African Americans Against the Bomb, Nuclear Weapons, Colonialism, and the Black Freedom Movement.
Thank you. First off, I want to thank Jay and Chuck for putting this and everybody else who put this all together for us. I also want to echo Elaine and thank everybody who is sticking with us and still here right now. Hopefully we can get you your second win. Ray and I will hopefully try to bring this thing home as the last two speakers for you. So especially students on a Sunday still being here, I really, really appreciate it. So I'm going to talk briefly just about my research and the book. And first, I just want to briefly state how I got started on this. When I was a young student, my whole life as an activist and an academic mainly revolved around the Black Freedom Movement. Nuclear weapons was never really much on my radar. It was very abstract. I never thought anybody would be crazy enough to use them, so it wasn't something that was really there for me until I went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the first time. And that was in 2005, and I was filled with so much rage and anger and guilt that when I came back, I realized I needed to find a way to combine these two passions of mine, which were eliminating racism and eliminating nuclear weapons. And so I started simply with the first question was, what did African Americans think about dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And when I pitched that idea, so many told me I wouldn't find anything because African Americans, understandably so, were so busy fighting for their own freedom and equality, they didn't have time to worry about this issue. But they were wrong. In June of 1964, there was a World Peace Study mission in which survivors, Hibakusha of the atomic bomb, and other peace activists were traveling the world. When they came to the United States, the person who organized their visit was the great Japanese-American activist Yuri Kachiyama. And she asked them all when they were here, what is it that you want to do most when you're in the United States? And they all responded, meet Malcolm X. But Malcolm at the time was traveling through Africa and the Middle East, and Yuri Kachiyama was friends with him and wrote him many letters, but never thought he actually received them. And the last day, she was having a reception at her house at her apartment with the survivors, and there was a knock on the door. And when she opened it, there was Malcolm. And Malcolm said to them, you've all been scarred by the atomic bomb, but we've been scarred too, and the bomb that hit us was racism. And he spent the day talking to them about the connections between Vietnam and colonialism, nuclear weapons, and racism, because he understood what so many before him understood, that the issue was not about civil rights, it was about human rights. And so my research looks at the intersection of race and nuclear weapons and those black activists who consistently argued that colonialism, the Black Freedom Movement, and nuclear weapons were inextricably linked. Now, as Zia mentioned earlier, when the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Truman said it was the greatest thing in history, most of the American people agreed with him. In fact, right after the atomic bombings, 85% of the American public in a poll in Gallup said they agreed with Truman's decision. A Roper poll a week later showed that 22% of the American people wished that Japan hadn't surrendered so we could have dropped more nuclear weapons and killed more people. And in fact, no poll up until late October in 1945 ever showed more than 4.5% of the respondents criticizing Truman's decision. But that wasn't the case in the black community. And while nothing's monolithic, what I saw was an outpouring of activists and artists and musicians and journalists and pastors and ordinary citizens all coming out against Truman's decision and questioning the use of nuclear weapons. If you go through the black press, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, you will see not just the columnists, but even letters to the editor, bus drivers and people working in beauty shops, rank and file African Americans criticizing Truman's decision. Langston Hughes was the first to come out in this country and actually question Truman's own racism in the decision to use nuclear weapons, and of course he was right to do so. Truman's not the most racist president we have. We probably have that now, but certainly one of the most. If you go through Truman's own diaries and journals, he rarely refers to African Americans as anything other than the N-word. This is a man who in interviews brags that in his family got out slaves as wedding presents to start out the housekeeping with. When his mother visited him at the White House for the first time, she said she'd rather sleep on the floor than ever step foot in Lincoln's bedroom. He sent a $10 check to the Ku Klux Klan to join, and they sent it back to him because he refused to fire Catholic workers in one of his businesses in Missouri. So it's no surprise that he would say this is the greatest thing in history when you're instantly killing hundreds of thousands of people of color. And so Of the most far-reaching criticism, it easily came from the Black Popular Front, most notably the great W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, who was so largely forgotten in our history. Du Bois likened Truman to Hitler, calling him one of the greatest killers of our day. Paul Robeson immediately went after the colonialism issue, asking the question, where are we getting the uranium to build nuclear weapons? And of course, the answer was the Belgian-controlled Congo. But so much of this first activism and protest went to a halt when Truman threw down the Truman Doctrine. Long before George W. Bush ever said it, it was Truman who said, you are either with us or against us. And so one of the worst things you could be in this country was to be black and red. So many groups ended up falling mute and silent and lives being destroyed with the rabid anti-communism that swept this country. But not everybody saw peace and nuclear disarmament as a bargaining chip. The NAACP made a sharp turn to the right on this issue, but not people like Du Bois and Robeson, because they saw the Korean War breaking out, and here we are threatening nuclear weapons on another people of color. They saw the hydrogen bomb being created in 1952, and then a year later, the Soviets creating it, and now the arms race is truly on. And so when a peace movement came out of Soviet bloc nations with a ban the bomb pledge, it was Du Bois and Robeson and others in the black community that took that and ran with it in the United States, garnering over 2.5 million signatures for the ban the bomb pledge, which back then in the early 50s had real consequences. People were beaten, people lost their jobs, they were deported, real consequences for signing that petition. And on the heels of the civil rights movement to get over 2.5 million signatures, people like Duke Ellington and Charlie Parker and Marian Anderson to sign on against nuclear weapons is extraordinary. And when you look at the 1950s, when the civil rights movement is really coming into play, in 1955, you have the heinous murder of Emmett Till in that summer. In December, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on the bus. But in the middle of that was also the Bandung Conference, the first all-African-Asian conference, in which here were these nations coming together, standing up against colonialism and white supremacy and nuclear weapons. And at the same time, the French government, wanting to be a colonial power, decided they were going to test their first nuclear weapon. Where? In the Sahara, in Africa. Right when Ghana was rising to power with Nkrumah and independence, right when the Algerian War was happening. And there was one man that started connecting all of these issues together, and it was Bayard Rustin. Rustin, another amazing figure in our movement that's completely iced out because he was gay. And so Rustin puts a team of activists together, African and American and British, to go there and try to stop the French test from actually happening. And he called it one of the greatest pieces of work that he ever did because he saw how these things were all connected. And of course, if we're going to talk about civil rights in the 1950s, you have to talk about Dr. King. People look at Dr. King getting into foreign policy as early as 1967, the year before he died, with his Beyond Vietnam speech. But when you look at nuclear disarmament, you will see actually a decade before he was speaking out against this issue. He routinely spoke out against this at black colleges and universities, saying it is so silly to care about integrating lunch counters and then not the world in which we are trying to integrate. What does it matter if we achieve all this social justice if we're all dead from nuclear war? It makes no sense. And who was he getting all this from? In many cases, his wife, Coretta. Coretta was a long-seasoned activist dating back to her days at Antioch College. She had been involved in Women's International League of Peace and Freedom and Women's Strike for Peace, so she always saw these connections, these things were connected. And she wasn't alone. Many black women, people like Lorraine Hansberry, who we all know for Raisin in the Sun, was so much more than that, a socialist, a feminist, and an anti-nuclear activist. Even the last play she wrote was about a nuclear holocaust and what happens to the two survivors when they make it out and after the bombing. And this continues throughout the 60s. With the Vietnam War, when again yet we are threatening to use nuclear weapons on a people of color. If you read the Black Panther Party's executive mandate number 1 that they publicly did in front of the Capitol with Bobby Seale in 66, you will see that they explicitly connect their fight for freedom with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And of course, many of us have talked about how we can get back to the 1980s and what we can learn from it. And at the peak of the 1980s, you saw such, not just the anti-nuclear movement was in full swing again, but that also meant in the black community. There were ordinary folks like Blacks Against Nukes, just two ordinary people, Greg Johnson and his wife Linda, librarians at Georgetown University with a rotary phone and one flyer started their own group in the black community. Hundreds of members in multiple chapters traveled to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and were featured on the covers of Ebony and Essence magazines and things of this nature. I'm so glad now we have a socially conscious athlete back with Michael Bennett or LeBron or Carmelo or Dwayne Wade, because you had that back in the 80s with Athletes United for Peace. JoJo Washington of the Boston Celtics, Marianne Washington, the first African-American women's basketball player. You had people now that were joining together with Russian athletes all trying to get rid of nuclear weapons. And of course, this all culminated in the June 12, 1982 rally, which 1 million people in Central Park. And it was the Reverend Herbert Daughtry, it was the Black United Front and the Third World People's Coalition, all working together so that 50% of the leadership that day was African American. Coretta Scott King was a co-chair. People like Shaka Khan and Rita Marley and so many others were performing. And you had thousands of African Americans pouring out of Bed-Stuy in Harlem, marching to get rid of racism, to get rid of nuclear weapons. Because again, they saw how these things were connected. How can you have somebody like Reagan saying he's going to increase military spending by $180 billion and cut social spending by $141 billion? How can you sit there and see all of the social services that were going away in the black community? And so again, they saw the economic conversion piece and how these things were related. And when you look at the history of black politicians, the Congressional Black Caucus, Obama, you will see that in many cases it were black politicians that were at the forefront of this. We talk about the 80s, it was Ron Dellums who was at the center of fighting Ronald Reagan on the MX missile. It was Dellums who went to Utah and met with Spencer Kimball, the head of the Mormon church, to convince him not to headquarter the MX missile there. You had people like Harold Washington, the first African-American mayor of Chicago, who won multiple awards for his anti-nuclear activities. Jesse Jackson, who in 1984 and 88 ran for president, his platform in the Democratic primary was much more anti-nuclear than any other candidate that was running. And so a lot of people came before President Obama. And Obama, as a student, wrote about nuclear weapons. He was a reporter at the June 12th march. As a candidate, spoke out against nuclear weapons. And when he got in office, right after that, in April, he gives his now famous Prague speech, arguably the most anti-nuclear speech any president has ever given, with possibly the exception of John Kennedy's presidential commencement address at American University in June of 1963. And I'll never forget, because I used to take students every summer to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I'll never forget the first year I took them after Obama became president. And I was seeing all these citizens walking around with T-shirts on that were calling themselves the Obama-jority. The mayor Akiba of Hiroshima had started this campaign. It was the first time we had U.S. ambassador at the ceremony, Ambassador Ruse. And I remember feeling proud of my president and what he was saying he was going to do. I had Japanese citizens handing me stacks of letters saying, give these to your president and thank him for what he's doing. And he started out on a certain path with the New START Treaty. He put groups together in conferences to try to get nuclear weapons materials in safe hands. In fact, he got enough nuclear weapons materials to make 4 bombs out of the Ukraine only months before it turned into chaos. He did what I think the most important thing of his presidency was the Iran nuclear deal. And of course, I will never forget being up in the middle of the night because of the time difference on Skype and crying with Hiroshima survivors as, at least symbolically, we watched the first sitting president visit Hiroshima. Now, did he do enough? Of course not. I would have liked him to eliminate more nuclear weapons and to take weapons off hair trigger alert and not sign on to the multi-trillion-dollar modernization plan. But I don't put that on him. I put that on us, because he never said, yes, I can. He said, yes, we can. And if there were 1 million people in the streets like there were in the 1980s out there demanding something, then maybe something would have been done. So I don't put it all on him. And so now what? What do we learn from this? Why study this? Why be here today? Well, to be completely honest, to fight so many years and dedicate so much of my life to eliminating racism and nuclear weapons, and now see a white supremacist and a racist in the White House with full control of our nuclear weapons, it's very easy for me to feel like a failure. But I made a promise years ago to the Hibakusha, specifically Koko Tenemoto Kondo, that I would never stop fighting on this front. And I feel now we have to fight more than ever. It's our responsibility. There is, as you heard from Bruce Blair, as you heard from so many today, we are really the only fail-safe left. There's nothing stopping this madman from using nuclear weapons. And as far as the intersection of race and nuclear weapons go, I don't think it could be any clearer. As Ray's going to talk about the nuclear ban treaty, you have over 100 nations fighting to get a nuclear ban treaty, signing on to this, when the majority of them are non-white nations. Now juxtapose that with 2 white authoritarian nationalist leaders in Putin and Trump who possess 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. Our president got the coveted Ku Klux Klan endorsement. He has advocated for Saudi Arabia, Japan, South Korea, getting their own nuclear arsenals, threatens to use them on people of color in Iran and North Korea. He has repeatedly talked about resuming nuclear testing, which we know what it will do, what it has done to Native Americans, French Polynesia, Australian Aborigines, Kazakhstan, the Marshall Islands. So I don't think it really can be any clearer. And when I talk to other groups that maybe don't see those connections, when I talk to parents and I talk to students in Baltimore specifically, where just this year and last year they didn't have enough heat in their public schools, so they were asking parents to bring in space heaters. And yet we're going to spend over $1.3 trillion on nuclear weapons when we have enough to end the world multiple times over, and we don't see how these things are connected? So what do we do about this? Well, one thing is we have to start thinking beyond our generation. And just because we can solve something that's after us, after our generation, is not a reason to fall into despair. I know that nuclear weapons and racism will be on this planet when I die. But if there is just a little bit less racism and fewer nuclear weapons for my young niece as she grows up, for my students, for future kids when they grow up, then that's all I can do. That's all any of us can do. The true impact of our activism will not be felt in this generation. And so you find hope in who came before us. As I researched this book, as I learned about these people, to see so many African Americans who were in the abyss, who were in their own misery fighting for their own equality, and then wield their collective power to try to eliminate nuclear weapons is extraordinary. And so when Obama, I believe it was in 2012, maybe a couple years before that, spoke at the Holocaust Museum, he said, remembrance without resolve means nothing. And awareness without action means nothing. So what you have gotten all day today, especially to the students that are still here, your brain is your biggest weapon. And what you've gotten all day is ammunition. But if you don't do anything with it, if you do nothing with this after you leave here, then we all failed. Everybody in here has gifts. I have no artistic ability whatsoever. I can't draw a stick figure to save my life. I can't play an instrument to save my life. I have my voice, my ability to write, my ability to teach. Everybody in here has gifts. What you do with it is your gift back. King always said the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, but not unless we bend it. Thank you.
Ray Acheson. She's director of the Reaching Critical Will, the disarmament program of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, or WILPF. She represents WILPF on the international steering groups of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, which won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. She advocates for disarmament and demilitarization and brings a feminist perspective to this international anti-war work. We're glad to have all three of you here today.
And I think everyone's in the mood for a little bit of more good news, yeah? All right. So my good news is that this is absolutely not an intractable problem. And I hope that from the last two speakers, you've already started to feel this. A lot of the talks today have described in great detail how difficult the problem is, the immensity of it, how bad things really are, and maybe a lot of this information is new to some of you. To those of you who have been doing this work for a long time, thank you for still being committed to work on it, and to those that are showing up for the first time today, I hope, like Vincent says, that you will stick with it. And so I'm going to try and provide a little bit of information about why it is worth your time to care about this issue and to do something about it yourselves. The point I want to start on is actually bringing us back to one of the first points that was made today. Zia was talking about how only 9 countries in the world have nuclear weapons. Only 9 countries. Now, there are a few other countries, the Western European states of the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and a couple of other US allies in the world that have some sort of theory that nuclear weapons provide security. And like Elaine said, this theory of deterrence that has become so embedded in the justification for nuclear weapons. But the thing is, the rest of the world does not think this way. The rest of the world doesn't not have nuclear weapons because they don't have the technical capacity to build it, or because they don't want to misspend their money or something. They don't want nuclear weapons. And this is something that I find I've understood more since living in the United States, that people here growing up with being surrounded by the doctrine that is embedded in culture about nuclear weapons maybe don't realize. But the rest of the world thinks nuclear weapons are really, really bad. Really bad. This isn't just a game to them. This is something extremely serious and extremely dangerous, and something that many countries in the world are willing to be very critical of. And so the challenge for us, one of the biggest challenges, I think, along with all the other technical things you've heard today, I think at the core of it is really challenging this notion of what security is. Whose security matters? Who gets to decide how we build our collective security and what that looks like in the world? And the profits and the entrenchment of our current security apparatus in this country and in the other nuclear-armed countries, that's where a lot of our energy and attention, I feel, is well placed. You don't have to understand all the technical issues around nuclear weapons to be able to confront this issue. You need to be upset with the current security paradigm, the current mismanagement of funds, like Vincent was just saying, misprioritization of where money is going in this country or in other nuclear-armed countries. And this is exactly what the nuclear ban treaty has tried to do, and what the countries and the activists pushing for this treaty have tried to do, is get to the security issues at the core of nuclear weapons. So we heard a question earlier today about why don't we just ban nuclear weapons? And the answer is, we have. We have banned nuclear weapons, only very recently, and it was a many-decade push, of course, for this to happen, and ramped up in the last 10 years to make it into a treaty that could be adopted at the United Nations. But we have a legally binding international prohibition on nuclear weapons. Now, where did this come from, and why haven't all of you heard about it? Well, it's because of the secrets and lies that Elaine was talking about, and it's because, like Vincent was saying, that it is really an initiative of the Global South. It is not a white-led initiative. It is not a Western-inspired idea. It is an initiative that came from the Global South, with over 120 countries at the United Nations saying, this is absolute madness. This has to stop. We will no longer tolerate this situation, and we're making these weapons illegal. It wasn't as simple as that. That took a lot of activism. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons was founded in 2007 and pushed for this treaty for 10 years, just for this treaty. Of course, anti-nuclear activism has been going on for a lot longer than that. But this campaign coalesced around the idea that the majority of the world's countries could adopt a legally binding treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, the same way that happened to ban landmines, the same way that happened to ban cluster munitions, to ban biological weapons and chemical weapons. And the motivation or the framework for this campaign was really also not just to work within the established channels of power that we are used to working within, to not just continue to appeal to the rationality of the nuclear armed states, because we understand that their sense of what is rational and realistic and credible is so far outside what we consider to be those things. And so changing the landscape where we work, changing the language of how we talk about nuclear weapons, taking power away from them, putting the conversation into new spaces, allowing new voices to be heard on this issue. So ICANN itself, I mean, there was questions earlier today as well about engaging youth. ICANN is a very young campaign. I used to be young when I started in ICANN, and I'm still pretty young. But it was a campaign led mostly by people in their 20s. It was a campaign that was led largely by activists of the Global South. We had many campaigners from Latin America, from Africa, from Southeast Asia, as well as from Western nations across Europe and in the US and Canada. We had a lot of women involved in the campaign. The campaign has been largely led by women, a lot of queer visibility in the campaign as well, and a lot of survivors and indigenous folks as well that have experienced the horrors of nuclear weapons firsthand in all the cases that Vincent was talking about. We had indigenous activists from Australia, Kazakhstan, the United States, and of course, survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki involved in the campaign as well. And on the government side, it was also diverse. It was largely led, like I said, by the governments of the Global South. And within those governments, we saw the highest records of women participating on behalf of these countries. There was an actual sponsorship program that a few governments funded, like the few Western governments that were involved tried to fund so that they could bring young female diplomats to these meetings from various countries. So there was an actual, an intentional effort made to make sure that the negotiations of this treaty, the process leading up to it, was diverse. And how this all started was with a reframing of the discourse of nuclear weapons. All the time in the United Nations, and certainly it's much, much worse in DC and in the other centers of nuclear power, that everything is very abstract. Everything is about how these weapons are for deterrence, they're for security. Some of these countries even refer to their nuclear weapons not as weapons, but as deterrents. They don't even use the word weapons. They'll say, our nuclear deterrent does this, as if that's a noun. And so we tried to take the power away from that discourse, that established mainstream discourse, and reignite the discussion on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. There had been those conversations, of course, in the 1960s and the 1980s. We were dealing with a post-Cold War generation of diplomats and activists that haven't been necessarily involved or immersed in those conversations. And so we sought to reinvest a lot of energy and attention into that discourse, shifting it back onto what nuclear weapons do to human beings, what they do to human bodies, what they do to the environment. They are not deterrents. They kill. They're designed and used to commit genocide, to slaughter civilians, to destroy entire cities. And so we really wanted to bring it back to that level to talk about that issue. And through that process of re-educating a whole new generation of diplomats at the United Nations and activists, young activists from around the world, we were able to build a growing momentum to prohibit these weapons. And I think where we are now with this treaty, it was adopted in 2017, in July. 122 countries voted for its adoption. The only countries who weren't participating in the negotiations were the nuclear armed states and those other countries I mentioned, the NATO allies that say that they rely on US nuclear weapons for their security. Everyone else came, participated, and voted for the adoption of this treaty at the UN. We need 50 countries to ratify the treaty for it to enter into force. So that is a process, a national level process. It has to go through parliaments or Congress. It has to have debates. Sometimes law has to be written. So that process is ongoing. We have 23 countries so far. So we're looking at this treaty probably entering into force in the next year or two. We have about 70 countries that have signed it already, which means that the head of state can just do that of their own volition. They don't have to go through parliament, and it signals an intention to sign. And ICANN has been pushing this treaty to be signed and ratified by the 122 that adopted it. But we're also working in the countries that don't support the treaty, that haven't yet supported the treaty. Many of these countries claim to be democracies, including this one. And so we were working within these countries with tools like a parliamentary pledge, trying to get opposition parties or parliamentarians, even of the parties that are in power, to sign up to say that they will commit to pushing for the national government to sign and ratify this treaty. In the United States, there's been a couple of Congress people that have signed on, but a lot of work needs to be done here in the US. We do call it the Congressional Pledge here, so don't worry, we've changed the language just for you. And that language is available on our website. It's icanw.org. All of these materials that I'm about to talk about can be found there. But also, where it's been interesting to see this really take off is some of the U.S. allies that don't support the treaty because they're following the United States instruction. Obama, actually, sorry, Vincent, instructed its allies to boycott the negotiations. and to reject the treaty if it was adopted. And so we're working a lot within those countries. And for example, one of the biggest success stories with the parliamentary pledge right now is in Australia, which has a defense relationship with the United States. Its ruling government is extremely right-wing right now, but they're about to have an election. And what ICANN campaigners in Australia have spent the last 2 years doing is getting the major opposition party parliamentarians to sign on to the pledge. And we actually now have about 80% of the major opposition party that have signed on to this pledge, and they managed at that party, the Labour Party's last annual general meeting, to get it adopted as the Labour Party's policy that they will sign and ratify the treaty if they come into power. They're about to have an election. It looks like they might win, and now campaigners have this tool that they can hold the new Australian government to account for if they do win. So these are the kinds of creative things that we're trying to do to upset balances of power, to make sure that we're raising public awareness. And that's another big thing that ICANN is trying to do within countries that don't currently support the ban treaty. And one of the ways that we're doing that is locally, through city initiatives. So in addition to this parliamentary pledge, we also have a cities appeal. And through that, our campaigners are going to local city councils, having debates, doing local media work, doing local stunts, publicity stunts, things like that, and getting cities to sign on to say that they support the abolition of nuclear weapons and they want the federal government, the national government, to join this treaty. And we've had some really big success with that. Los Angeles has signed on to this. Baltimore has signed on to this. My hometown, Toronto, has signed on to this. Melbourne and Sydney in Australia, countries across Europe, or cities across Europe are joining it as well. So this is something that everybody can do that is achievable. It gives you good insight about how to work politically by starting with your city council. It's a good tool to raise awareness with your friends. It's something student groups can take up. And it's not just symbolic. There's also some real practical things that can go along with this. And one of these big initiatives is around divestment. So nuclear weapons, we've heard a little bit about today in terms of the profits and the corporate interests that are involved in producing these weapons and sustaining the nuclear arsenal. One of the biggest initiatives that ICANN's had ongoing now for years, even before we got the treaty, is something called Don't Bank on the Bomb. And there's a few different elements to this. One is your own personal finances. You can check don'tbankonthebomb.com. You can go on that website and check and see if your bank is investing in companies that produce nuclear weapons. If they are, you can call up your bank and ask them to stop doing that. If they won't stop doing that, you can move your money to a bank or another source that has pledged to not invest in nuclear weapons. Now, I always hesitate talking about that in the US because there's not that many US banks that don't invest in nuclear weapon production. But in New York, we have a bank, Amalgamated Bank. I don't know if that's also in Jersey. Is it in Jersey? Yeah, okay. It's not in Jersey, okay. But so that's a good campaign for New Jersey folks to look at, is if you can get at least one bank to say, and then direct everybody to turn to that bank. But the other thing that we're doing is at the city level, asking for city funds to be withdrawn from nuclear weapon producing companies. And so in New York City, for example, we have a really cool divestment campaign on right now. We're working with the comptroller of New York City and the budget specialists to see if we can get city-level divestment from nuclear weapons. That's also already ongoing for fossil fuels in a lot of cities. So it's something that people will already be familiar with, this process of divestment, and you can kind of work with those that have done that work to figure out how to bring this to your city. So the message basically is that there's a lot of things you can do without necessarily having to be working within the corridors of power of Washington, D.C., without having to know all the ins and outs of how the nuclear bomb works. All you really need to know is that they're bad, they're going to kill us all. That is inevitable if we let this situation continue, and that there's a lot of people out there that care about this. You are not alone as Americans in solving this problem. The rest of the world is trying to help by doing things like banning the bomb. And there's a lot of tools and resources, and there's a lot of really great networks through the ICANN campaign that you can be connected to people around the world that are doing this work. And that's been one of the greatest things about ICANN, in my opinion, has been just the energy, the commitment, the passion, the creativity that's been brought into this issue for a whole new generation of activists and for government leaders. So I hope that inspires and offers a little bit of hope at the end of a long day, that this is worth it and worth all of our energy and time, and it is solvable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray, Vincent, Elaine. We have time for maybe one or two questions. Professor Bert Kimmelman from our Humanities Department.
Thank you, Chuck. My question is for Professor Scarry. When you mentioned that at the Constitutional Convention and the creation of the Bill of Rights, that at the time the second break, as you put it, about the right to bear arms, that the concern was harm to others, I was amazed in hearing that. Because I don't think people in America, at least, think like that now. And in thinking about the historical points on your timeline and up to the dropping of a nuclear bomb, and how things changed after that. And then also thinking about what I took especially from Professor Lifton's talk, that nuclear weaponry there's a categorical difference in the nuclear weaponry, and you were talking about what you were defining as obscenity, having to do with killing more than one with a weapon, let's say, or something like that. That seemed to be what you were saying. In any case, I'm wondering if you have any idea of when the shift occurred in, let's say, American thinking, when the right to bear arms had to do more with self-defense, deterrence, to use that term, and and also just mentioning what was Daniel Ellsberg mentioned about James Mattis, that at one point he really was for getting rid of at least a tactical nuclear weaponry, but then when he got inside the organization, let's call it, that he sang a different tune. And that may have been, it occurred to me, because he had some sense of there being an emergency. And that sense of emergency, which may have come about because of the categorical, overwhelming magnitude of what we had wrought in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that put America on a kind of a different psychological footing. It's a complicated, multifaceted question, but any thoughts you might have? Thank you.
Okay. It is a multifaceted question, so let me concentrate on a few of the facets. So the right to bear arms, if you remember, even as it's stated in the Constitution, that an opposition is made between a standing army and a militia. And by standing army, what they meant was a military force that is subject only to the executive will, that bypasses the population and is in the control of the executive. That is everything that a nuclear weapon is. A nuclear weapon is military force now taken from all of us and compressed into a weapon and put in the hands of a solitary person. As for defense, actually the right to bear arms was for defense in this sense, that our capacity for one thing about nuclear weapons is that we have lost the capacity for self-defense. Self-defense is the basis of all the other rights. The reason we care about freedom of speech, there are many reasons to care about, but one reason is I can defend myself better. I can explain why I didn't do this or I did do this. So right to a jury, again, is the right of self-defense. So when you take away the right of self-defense, you are miniaturizing civic stature to a huge, huge degree. And the whole nuclear language uses the language of defense. There's nothing about nuclear weapons that's defensive. we don't have fallout shelters. Only the president has the huge Mount Weather fallout shelter. There's no protection for the people. There's no way any of us can defend ourselves against a nuclear weapon. So it has robbed the people of Earth from the right of self-defense. In the very beautiful meaning of that word, and also the capacity for mutual aid, because self-defense always meant that I not only help myself, but I can help the next person. And now there's almost no way to help the next person in line. And so maybe I'll stop there, because as you acknowledge, your question was very rich with many parts to it.
This question is for Ray. I live in Hiroshima, and even in Japan, even in Hiroshima, there are plenty of people who have never heard of the ban treaty and who have not heard that ICANN won the Nobel Prize. The Beatrice Finn comes over and does a tour, and we all pay attention for a few minutes, and then it's gone. And we're forgetting about it. And the reason for that is because we in the peace community in Japan have no money. I work with Hidankyo, which is the largest survivor organization over there, and we are working with 47 NGOs that are all working on this nuclear issue, and we have no money. And I'm wondering if you see any prospect of getting some money, some serious money into this campaign. 122 countries ought to be able to come up with several $1 million a year with no problem. The landmine campaign for the last 4 or 5 years was spending $2 or $3 million a year getting Princess Diana on TV every night. We are not doing that. And we need some millions of dollars to have any effect. And if we don't, even if ICANN gets, this treaty to come into force, it's going to be forgotten unless the consciousness of human beings is raised about this, until people start hating and fearing nuclear weapons. And the way to do that is through the media with lots of money. And I wonder if you see any prospect or any way that we can get that kind of money into this.
I think if I knew how to get that kind of money, we would maybe be in a different. You wouldn't have to ask that question, right? I think I would have used my skills for that if I had that skill set, which I don't. Yeah, and what's interesting is winning the Nobel Peace Prize, I think, helped ICANN grab attention for a very short period of time. But what's interesting is finding people, today that don't really know that happened, or barely even know what the Nobel Peace Prize is. And so that kind of surprised me too, that it wasn't more of a catalyst for public awareness raising. But I think it's provided us with more of an opportunity than we would have had otherwise. I don't know how to get millions of dollars to anti-nuclear campaigning. I mean, we've always tried, of course, to bring in different kinds of donors and get support from different places, but it was really hard. And actually, in the early days of ICANN, some of the countries that really supported the landmines treaty were financially supportive of ICANN, but as the United States really cracked down on them, a lot of that money dried up and disappeared. So that's also been an issue that we didn't necessarily have with the landmines campaign as well. And it would be great if we had very prominent spokespeople giving their time and energy to this issue. And I know that people are spending effort trying to cultivate those relationships, but that's, like I said, not in my skill set personally. So if any of you here know people that want to lend their fame to this issue, please see us after class.
Well, you guys are great. Great panel again. Thank you. Every panel's been terrific today, and thanks for the planning committee to put together this thing today. I go to a lot of these things, and this is one of the best I've ever been to, if not the best. And I'm sorry, I'm going to break a rule here. This is more of a comment, but I'd love to hear your comments on this. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time, and I've been thinking about a lot today. Another thing that I think we all need to be thinking about in terms of being active is is thinking towards that. I've heard a lot of people talk today about, well, you know, in 2021, maybe we'll have another president. Hopefully I'll do the president. Sometimes we even assume there will be a new president, but I don't think we should make that assumption. And I think we all need, the other way we can all be active is to make sure that we're all registered to vote, that all of our friends are registered to vote. And I think this movement needs to ally itself very strongly with those efforts in this country to stop voter suppression. One of the reasons that we're in the fix we're in now is because a lot of people who would like to exercise their right to vote have not been allowed to do so. And that effort is going to continue and accelerate over the next 2 years. And so I would really also encourage us to think about how we can work together with those groups that are fighting voter suppression in this country between now and the next presidential election. And if you have comments about that, great. But
I'll just make one comment and to say that I agree that it's crucial that the vote be very large in this next election. I don't think it's at all a given that we won't have the same president we have now after that election. But I also want to say, while completely agreeing with what you've just said, that this is a structural problem. It's not just a problem of one specific person, Donald Trump. If anything, his recklessness has made it more visible. But many presidents had contemplated using the nuclear weapons first. I mentioned the 2 by Eisenhower, but we know that JFK, according to Robert McNamara, 3 times came within a hair's breadth of all-out nuclear war, not once in Cuba, but 3 times. We know that LBJ considered dropping a nuclear weapon on China to prevent China from getting a nuclear weapon. We know that Nixon has said that 4 times he considered using nuclear weapons. And by considered using a nuclear weapon, it doesn't just mean a stray thought went through someone's mind. In Nixon's case, he sent 18 B-52s loaded with nuclear weapons over Russia towards Vietnam. It was a feint, but it could have been misconstrued and become disastrous. The record stops there because presidential papers are secret. And when we find out what our leaders right now are doing, how close did Trump come? How close did Obama come? I hope not close. I hope none of them came close. But take for a moment the minute when on 9/11, George Bush stops at Offnet Air Force Base, okay? Nowhere in the record does it say to the American people, he stopped at Offnet Air Force Base. That's the base that's in charge of our nuclear nerve center, not only for response to nuclear states, but in response to terrorists. A nuclear response to terrorists, which makes no sense. Terrorists are lone actors. Why would you use a nuclear weapon? So we may find out that he stopped there because a nuclear option against whatever phantom country he had decided was responsible was on their minds. But we'll only find out now 20 years from now, and which point it will recede. So yeah, we have a big problem with who's presently in the White House, just because he's more unpredictable than most. But even the most sane, stable president isn't sane and stable 100% of the day, and therefore it's urgent that we change the structure.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a connection there. So take, for example, one of my close friends is Desmond Meade. Desmond Meade is the gentleman that now everybody knows about in Florida who led the campaign to get 1.4 million nonviolent felons now the right to vote. And so, you know, when I lived in Florida and I worked with him on this, or worked with Dream Defenders when Trayvon Martin was murdered, and now what they're doing is the Florida legislature is trying to stop it. So they're saying now all of these nonviolent felons first have to pay back all of their court costs before they can vote, which is just it's a poll tax. So my point is, now when I'm working with them on that issue and I have these relationships with them, it's also, those are the times when I'm talking to them and saying, you know what, yeah, I'm working on this issue, but the most important thing when you're voting for everybody should be, if we ever face with another Cuban Missile Crisis, who do you want sitting in Kennedy's chair? Like, to me, that, no pun intended, trumps everything. Or when I'm up there with, you know, working with Dee Watkins up in Baltimore, and we're doing this issue on, you know, if we're talking about public schools and that, and then this is when you can tie in an economic conversion piece. So that intersectionality and working within these existing movements to tie in voting issues, to tie in the nuclear issue, there's room there that you can start combining those things. So I think it's really important that, yeah, you're looking at voter issues and voter ID laws and all of these things, but then it also opens the door to combine it with nuclear disarmament issues. I don't see them as again, separate
All
silos.
right, thank you. And thank you to all the speakers, to all of you who came today. It's been a great conference, a lot of work. Thank you to the conference committee. Thank you to NJIT for supporting us.
I'm so glad to see your stuff here.